My name is Mara Policelli, and I'm the Executive Director of the Washington office with the Keough School of Global Affairs. And I'm pleased to be hosting today's event. The Keough School of Global Affairs at Notre Dame is co-hosting today's event with the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. And we're thrilled to be welcoming a dear friend of the Keough School and the Kroc Institute, Séverine Autesserre, who's here with us today to share her book, her new book, Frontlines of Peace. And along with her, we have two of our esteemed colleagues at the Keough School to comment and respond on her presentation. So I'll take a moment to introduce our three presenters today, and then we'll move forward with Séverine's presentation. So Séverine Autesserre is an award-winning author, peace builder, and researcher. She's a professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia University. She's author of The Trouble with the Congo, Peaceland, and The Frontlines of Peace, which she will be presenting on today. She has been involved intimately in the world of international aid for more than 20 years and conducted research in 12 different conflict zones, from Colombia to Somalia to Israel in the Palestinian territories. So she will be joined after her presentation by Laurie Nathan. He is a director of the new Mediation program at Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, where he's also a core faculty member. The Mediation program serves as an international center of excellence for mediation research, training, policy, and practice. He's a senior mediation advisor to the United Nations, serves on the UN Academic Advisory Council on Mediation, and is the lead designer and trainer at the UN High-Level Mediation course. And Rachel Sweet will be with us. She's the assistant professor of politics and global affairs at the Keough School. She's core faculty member at the Kroc Institute and a concurrent faculty member at the Department of Political Science. Rachel's research focuses on armed conflict, governance, and state capacity in fragile environments, and the methodology and data of studying civil wars and armed violence, particularly in East and Central Africa. So we have an incredible panel of experts with us, and I'm sure a wonderful discussion before us. We will have time after the discussion for questions. We have some of you submitted questions when you registered, so we have those, as well as the opportunity to take questions towards the end of our time together, which you can submit in the Q&A function of your Zoom screen. So we'll have some time at the end to take those questions to the panel. So for now, I would like to turn things over to Séverine for her presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Mara, for this very kind introduction and for inviting me. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure to be back to the Notre Dame Keough School of Global Affairs. I have wonderful memories of the in-person events that I've done in the past few years. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be talking with you now remotely, given that from what I understand, we have people joining us from all over the world today, which is absolutely fantastic. As for me, I'm joining you from my home in New York City. I still can't really access my office because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it doesn't matter because I'm absolutely thrilled to be talking with you about my new book, The Frontlines of Peace. And now you should be able to see my slide right now. If someone could not, okay, fantastic. So The Frontlines of Peace is a book about hope. It's a book about the ordinary and yet extraordinary individuals and communities that have found effective ways to confront violence. And that's really important because, as you know, 1.5 billion people live under the threat of violence in more than 50 conflict zones around the world, in the countries that you now see in red on my map. And so peace building is a crucial task for many states and international institutions. And by peace building, I really mean any and all actions that help promote peace before, during, and after a conflict. The thing is that our templates and techniques for approaching war and peace just don't work. Afghanistan, Colombia, Congo, Syria, Ukraine, Myanmar, we've heard the same story many times before. There was violence, the United Nations got involved, donor countries pledged millions in assistance, warring parties called for ceasefires, they signed agreements, held elections, and the headlines praised peace. And then a week or two later, sometimes just days later, violence flared up again. Often it had never actually stopped. And in many cases, it lasted for years after. You know that more than half of all ongoing wars have already lasted for more than 20 years. And in just the past 5 years, wars have spawned the worst refugee crisis since World War II. And our newspapers keep running headlines like the ones that you see on my slide. Inhabitants of war-torn countries and onlookers from the outside are fed up with the apparent inability of governments, peacekeepers, and international institutions to end violence. And there has been plenty of discussion about what has gone wrong when we've tried to stop wars in the past. But now I think it's time to ask what has gone right. And it turns out that elections don't build peace, and democracy itself may not be the golden ticket, at least not in the short term. Contrary to what most politicians preach, building peace doesn't require billions in aid or massive international interventions. Instead, it often involves giving power to ordinary citizens. Ultimately, many successful examples of peace building in the past few years have involved innovative grassroots initiatives led by local people and at times supported by foreigners, just like the South African officer you now see with me on the photo, and often using methods shunned by the international elite. So rather than focusing on handshakes between presidents and abstract peace agreements and negotiations between government and rebel leaders, the Frontlines of Peace details the concrete, everyday actions that actually make a difference on the ground. And you'll see, some of these are bizarre, some are creative, some involve age-old traditions, and some are just common sense. My book explains how peace building can actually work so that we can finally help improve the lives of billions of people. And I showed that to end violence from war and also to address violent conflicts at home, whether home is New York, Washington, DC, Indiana, or Paris. We have to fundamentally change the way we view and build peace. And I make this argument by building on more than 20 years of work in 12 different conflict zones, where I worked both as an aid worker and a researcher. And I want to tell you the story of Keough, which is quite literally an island of peace in Congo. For the past 25 years, one of the deadliest conflicts since World War II has raged around Keough. And despite the presence of one of the largest and most expensive peacekeeping missions in the world, several million people have died and hundreds continue to die every day. But Keough itself has avoided mass violence. And what makes the place really noteworthy is that the island contains all of the same preconditions for violence that have led to generalized fighting in other parts of Congo. You have a geostrategic location. Keough is located right at the border between Congo and Rwanda, two countries that have been at war regularly since the 1990s. You also have mineral resources, ethnic tensions, lack of state authority, extreme poverty, local conflicts over land and traditional power, and many other features that have led to generalized fighting in the neighboring provinces. And what's fascinating about Keough is that the island is peaceful because of the active, everyday involvement of all of its citizens, including the ones you see in my photos, and including the poorest and least powerful ones. So it's not the state, the police, or the army who manage to control tensions, and it's not foreign peace builders either. It is the members of the community themselves. And they do that by fostering what they call a culture of peace, by organizing in grassroots associations and local structures that help resolve conflicts, and by drawing on strong beliefs that help deter violence by both insiders and outsiders, such as blood pacts. Blood pacts are traditional promises between two parties who agree never to hurt each other. And so the story of Keough shows that local community resources can sometimes build peace better than the usual elite agreements and outside interventions. And foreign peace builders can help in this process. So take the teams of the Life and Peace Institute in Congo. LPI is a Swedish peacebuilding organization that is involved in various conflict zones and usually focuses on working at the grassroots. And the LPI Congo team bases its actions on in-depth local expertise, and they reject universal approaches to peace building. They rely on local employees supervised by a few foreigners, and these foreigners often have extensive pre-existing country knowledge. LPI doesn't implement programs directly. Instead, it works with and through a few hand-picked local organizations. And the main role of these organizations is to support local people on the ground. These local organizations empower ordinary citizens to develop their own analysis of their community's conflict, agree on the most feasible answers, just like they are doing in the photo you now see on my slide, and then implement those solutions. So you see the difference with the usual way to build peace in conflict zones. In the LPI model, it's not foreigners based in headquarters and capital cities who conceive, design, and implement peace-building programs. It's not national or provincial elites either, and it's not the state or the government. Instead, it is the intended beneficiaries themselves, including former combatants or ongoing combatants, and including ordinary people, who conceive, design, and implement peace-building initiatives with the help of LPI and its local partners. So outsiders can help reestablish peace, but to really help, they can't continue acting the way they usually do, because there are countless limitations with the conventional way to build peace, which I call Peace Inc., and which relies on governments, elites, and foreign peace builders, and usually excludes ordinary citizens and grassroots activists. The Peace Inc. conventional approach to peace building relies on misleading and detrimental assumptions, like the idea that only top-down intervention can end armed violence. The idea that all good things come together. So for instance, that elections will naturally lead to peace. And the idea that only outsiders have the required skills and expertise to build peace. And of course, I'm happy to elaborate on the problems with our usual approach to peace during the discussion if you're interested, but I want to use the few minutes that I have left to tell you how we can change that. Because I really think that we need to focus on success stories instead of always looking at issues, challenges, and failures. So these past few years, I've looked for cases of what I call unlikely peace, places where everything conspires to cause violence, and yet somehow you have peace, like in Italy. And I found places like that all over the world, in Afghanistan, Colombia, Israel and the Palestinian territory, Somalia, for instance, in the 2 villages where I took the photos you now see on my slide. And the example I like best is the story of Somaliland. There is a really interesting contrast between, on the one hand, Somalia, which is extremely violent, has some of the highest rankings in the world's least desirable categories, most corrupt country, second most failed state, etc. And on the other hand, you have this autonomous region in the north of Somalia that is called Somaliland, that went through a devastating independence war with Somalia in the late 80s and in the 1990s, a war that destroyed nearly 90% of the towns, some of which still haven't been rebuilt, as you can see in the photo I took when I was there. But for the past 20 years, Somaliland has experienced little violence, little terrorism. It now has a well-functioning state, decent public services, as you can see in my photo of the capital, Hargeisa, and even some kind of functioning democracy. And of course, there are many reasons for this difference. But the key one is that the usual Peace Inc. top-down, outsiders-led approach prevailed in the rest of Somalia, while Somaliland benefited from sustained grassroots peace-building initiatives that were led by insiders, by Somalilanders themselves. And the good news, and the story of Somaliland, by the way, is really important because it shows that local people can promote peace, not only on a small scale, like in Italy, but also over a large territory and a quasi-state. And so the good news is that we can promote this kind and support this kind of efforts without falling into the same old tired relationships between insiders and outsiders, and without destroying local peace efforts as interveners so often do, because they're role models we can learn from. And in my research, I found a lot of original, out-of-the-box approaches by interveners who did manage to put local people in the driver's seat and to really make a difference, a positive difference, both at the highest level and on the ground. These people, and I talk about them a lot in the book, and they come from all over the world, and they come from very different countries, they work in very different countries, they work for very different organizations, but they have a few things in common. They don't believe that as outsiders, they know better. They have the right theory, skills, and expertise, or that they bring the ideal solutions to people's problems. Instead, they respect local residents, they listen to them, and they're open-minded. They understand that other people may have a different understanding of peace, democracy, and development, and different priorities. They also know the local context well. They speak at least some of the local languages, and they have extensive local networks. They are in it for the long run. They stay on site for years, sometimes decades. They don't place themselves at the forefront of peace efforts, and they don't put their logos everywhere, but instead they remain low profile, and they turn the spotlight on the achievements of their local partners, local staff, local organizations, local authorities. They're flexible. They keep adapting their strategies based on the results and feedback that they get and the way the situation evolves. And lastly, they understand that sometimes there are hard choices to make because all good things do not go together. So we may have to choose between worthy goals, for instance, between peace and justice or peace and democracy. And the best interveners understand that they shouldn't be the ones to make these choices, but the people who have to live with the consequences of a decision should be the ones making it. And by way of conclusion, there is one last thing that I want to mention. All of these ideas, all of these lessons from conflict zones can help us address not only tensions in war zones around the world, but also political, cultural, religious, and ethnic conflicts in the United States and in Europe, in ostensibly peaceful countries. And I'm more than happy to talk more about that during the discussion if you're interested. But the overall point is that whether at home or abroad, we sorely need more individuals that are like the inhabitants of Keough and Somaliland. We sorely need more organizations that work like the Life and Peace Institute, and more programs that follow the basic principles I've just told you about. Because it's with organizations and programs like these that we can help the 1.5 billion people who live under the threat of violence, and that we can also decrease tensions and violence in our own communities. So of course, all of these are not magic wands, but because they take into account deeply rooted causes of conflict, they can definitely be game changers. Thank you so much for listening. I'm really looking forward to the discussion by Laurie and by Rachel, and to the discussion with all of you afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Séverine. That was fantastic and very inspirational. I have a seminar that I'm teaching this this semester, and will certainly be sending the recording of this discussion to my students later today or tomorrow, if they're not already watching. So thank you very much for that overview and highlights from your book. And I'm going to now turn it over to Rachel to offer some reflections on your book and share some of her expertise on this discussion. So Rachel.
Great, thank you, Maura, and thank you so much, Séverine, for your presentation and for being here with us today to share your amazing book project. I want to highlight just first a couple key contributions that I see in this book, offer one key extension of the analysis, and then I'll close with two main questions as well that are sourced from people within conflict zones today. So some of the key contributions that I see and that are evident in the book is Séverine's use of hundreds of interviews with people on the ground, extensive time in conflict-affected countries. Séverine demonstrates a strong argument for grassroots consultation and conflict analysis and an engagement. And as in her other work, she's highly critical of top-down approach, UN bureaucrats and government agencies. The argument builds on and extends already solid foundations laid in research on governance and institutions and conflict environments, where pre-existing networks and leaders are already working to get things right. Examples of Keough and Somaliland highlight that well. And her goal is to highlight the many grassroots structures and activists who are already making successful differences. One of the key contributions is to highlight some of the variation that exists within conflict-affected environments. Sometimes from the outside, there's ideas about conflict zones being sites of unmitigated violence or chaos, but looking to these islands of peace, like Keough, as an example, helps to draw out some of the more textured realities of what conflict environments look like. Based on my decade of experience in Congo, this is a highly accurate portrayal of the bifurcated realities that exist between the UN missions, the NGO world, and the everyday communities and everyday Congolese livelihoods. Séverine highlights some of the distinctions between viewing technical expertise versus local engagement. And she names and takes on some of these assumptions head on, some of these assumptions about communities being corrupt or violent, and recommends knowledge of country specialists and local people to be prioritized rather than just technical expertise. I want to share my screen just very briefly, just for one quick slide, to demonstrate some of the critical stakes today of what Séverine is discussing. These are some images of ongoing protests against the UN mission in Congo that have been happening this April and this May. And what we see here is a result of the consequences of the insider-outsider mentality of intervention, where high walls and the inability to speak local languages and develop local relationships prohibit UN peacekeepers from developing an accurate understanding of the contours of conflicts and prevent them from developing local relationships. I think that there's oftentimes a pushback or hesitation or questions about the extent to which this is actually a reality from people looking in from the outside. So I just wanted to echo and underline that this is very much the case, and to highlight that some of the key collective action and organizing by grassroots communities on the ground here is asking the UN mission to leave as a result of what they see as the inability to protect local communities. So these are some of the key consequences of if we don't get it right, and the mistrust that can develop. So moving on from those extensions, I have two main questions of how we might be able to go further still. So many NGOs and UN personnel have begun to adopt some of this language of the local turn in peacekeeping. And many NGOs you go to each one has their own story about how they're different and how they are more locally engaged than the NGO next door or than the UN mission next door. So my question for Séverine is, for new and aspiring peace builders, how might we know who is using the rhetoric of local engagement versus who is actually doing it? And what kind of really fine-grained on-the-ground work does it take for us to be able to make those determinations? The book provides some core examples of international peace builders who get it right. Sometimes some of those are also people who are living in nice homes on the lake and who are using their own chauffeurs as well. So how do we also use this book as an invitation for a starting point and to build further and to ask ourselves how to take local community knowledge, local organizations as the starting point, and to even work under local organizations to be our own authority figures. And then the reality is that many international peace builders want to work with communities, but also need funding or want to have a voice at the international level. So what are some pointers about peace builders who want to be locally embedded and connected, but also need to seek dialogue with the powerful large-scale organizations? And then my last question in closing comes from a community in the Ruzizi Plain. Séverine's book highlights another example. Many examples are given throughout the book. One of the problems that she uncovers is that the standard approach overlooks local level conflicts and focuses on national level and international level cleavages instead. And she provides an example from the Ruzizi Plain in Eastern Congo, where Congolese organizations had themselves addressed these tensions in conjunction with the Life and Peace Institute. Over the weekend, I had the chance to talk with one of the chief's families there in the Ruzizi Plain and to discuss that example. And one of the key questions for you from this conversation came out about, these are local level conflicts, but how can we protect local community resources and local community organizations in environments where the state and the National Army is also involved in a predatory force in the conflict? So how might, and what might the role of international peace builders in supporting that be? So in sum, the book is essential reading that I would highly recommend. There's core lessons on peace building without big budgets, taking local conflicts seriously, and making local organizations the starting point that help us to reorder our focus on what we prioritize in international peace building. So thank you. And then Laurie, I'll hand it over to you next.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you to my colleagues at Keough and Kroc for organizing this event. And thank you very much to my fellow panelists. I think Séverine is doing our field a great service by acknowledging the importance of local actors, local peacemakers, and critiquing the role and the interventions and the style of external peacemakers. In South Africa, I headed a Center for Conflict Resolution where we did community peacemaking in Cape Town and also in neighboring countries, and it was exasperating to butt heads with external peacemakers that came across as knowing far more about our conditions and what we should or shouldn't be doing than we did. So I really respect and am grateful for that. I want to pick up on Severine's introductory remarks where she says that in contrast to abstract peace agreements and negotiations between governments and rebel leaders, her book focuses on concrete actions by local peacemakers that actually make a difference on the ground. So I'm really taking issue with this framing because at Kroc, as we all know, we study and support peace agreements. We study and support peace negotiations between governments and rebels, and would argue that these negotiations and agreements are definitely concrete, they are not abstract, and they definitely make a huge difference on the ground. Peace negotiations determine whether a society which is at war is able to transition to peace or remains locked in armed conflict or gets trapped in a kind of no war, no peace limbo. And where negotiations do succeed in ending wars, the parties typically rewrite the rules of politics and governance for better or worse. Peace agreements typically address questions of human rights, rule of law, gender equality, minorities, and the structural causes of violence and exclusion, with far-reaching implications for society and for citizens. My main point here is that local peacemakers are not disconnected from these formal peace processes. On the contrary, throughout the world, local peacemakers have made significant contributions to the formal negotiation processes. And therefore, as a way of supplementing Severine's focus on local peacemaking and peace building, I'm going to identify briefly 8 roles that local peacemakers play in relation to formal negotiations. First, prior to negotiations, local peacemakers have arranged confidence-building exercises that facilitate dialogue between party representatives in order to improve the climate for a formal peace process. Second, during formal negotiations, local peacemakers in some countries have participated directly in the negotiations, raising gender and other civil society concerns that might otherwise be ignored. Thirdly, local peacemakers have participated indirectly in formal negotiations through public advocacy or by facilitating workshops that include the negotiators or by providing administrative and expert support to the formal negotiations. Fourth, local peacemakers have drawn on research, on comparative experience, and on local knowledge to make a policy contribution, a progressive policy contribution to negotiations on a range of issues: security sector reform, women's rights, land, and rights of indigenous communities. Fifth, local peacemakers have played mediation, monitoring, training, and other peacemaking roles at local level while formal negotiations are underway at the national level. And the local has reinforced the national and has helped to link the national to the local. Sixth, following successful negotiations, local peacemakers have supported the implementation of peace agreements through monitoring and other activities. Seventh, local peacemakers have participated in national dialogue and constitutional reform processes that follow the formal negotiations and that are intended to consolidate peace agreements. And then 8 local peacemakers have contributed in many ways to forging intergroup reconciliation, both during and after formal negotiations. So this is, of course, an incomplete list of the roles that local peacemakers play in relation to formal peace negotiations. There isn't time to add other roles or provide country examples, of which there are many, nor is there time to discuss the diverse identities and agendas of these local peacemakers and to address the interesting questions of their effectiveness, limitations, and challenges. But I want, through these brief remarks, to kind of capture and make the point that peace is built through numerous efforts by many actors, both elite and grassroots, through a variety of activities in both formal and informal processes at both national and local levels, and in a range of ways that are interrelated and often integrated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurie and Rachel, for that fantastic feedback, reflections, and some very provocative questions for Séverine. So we'll take, another 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes to discuss some of these fantastic points and reflections to expand this conversation. And then there are numerous questions that have come in the Q&A, so I'll turn to those shortly. So Séverine, back to you to respond to some of the comments from Rachel and Laurie.
Thank you so much. Well, Rachel, Laurie, thank you so much for thinking about the Frontlines of Peace and for preparing these really thoughtful and thorough comments. And I'm super grateful. So thank you. And I'm going to start with Laurie's comments because they're the freshest in my mind, and then I'll go back to Rachel's points if you don't mind. So Laurie, I think you and I are perfectly in agreement. We're saying the same thing, and we may be using different words, and we may put the emphasis on different points, but we're saying exactly the same thing. The 8 contributions by local peacemakers that you've just listed, you can see that I detail them in the Frontlines of Peace. And the Ruzizi Plain example that Rachel was mentioning actually is a concrete illustration of many of these contributions. The Somaliland example that I've just told you about today, to me, that's, you've seen in the book, there are many elaborations on these 8 points or on at least many of these 8 points that you mentioned, because local communities were absolutely essential in helping have this kind of really formal, effective peacebuilding agreements that we've seen in Somaliland. And again, as you say, we don't have time to go through every single country and highlight every single examples, but I think we're completely in agreement with that. I think you'll also agree with me that there is not one example in the world of a purely top-down peace agreement that actually made a difference on the ground. The big research that was launched by people in the UK, spearheaded by Christine Cheng, where they reviewed 20 different countries, formal peace agreements, elite agreements, and they found that it was published by the UK, by the United Kingdom aid. You have the full references in my book, but what's absolutely fascinating is that they asked experts, country experts, local experts, and international experts to review 22 cases of formal peace agreement, elite level peace agreements, and they found that not any single one of them was a clear-cut example of success. And it goes back to what you were saying, Laurie, and what I'm arguing in the book, that we really need to have grassroots bottom-up initiatives complement the top-down initiatives. And that's where, to me, that's where as a field, we have a lot more work to do, is that we know that we need to have this kind of connection that you were mentioning, Laurie. But these kind of connections, usually we have some of them, or we have them, but they're not supported. They're not supported. They don't get, first, I mean, many of us don't know about them. And also they don't get the material, logistic, financial, symbolic support that they deserve and that they need. So what the Frontlines of Peace is doing is trying to turn the spotlight on these local contributions, these grassroots contributions, so that, yes, I agree, I completely agree with you. As I say in the book, peace is built, sustainable peace is built when it comes from the top down and from the bottom up, when we work with the elite and with the grassroots. We have to change the way we work with the elite, as I've been, you remember my little stick figure on the slide. And to do that, we need to support more the grassroots efforts. We need to pay more attention to them. And that's, to me, the way forward. And that's where we still have a lot of work to do as a field. Because as there are exceptions, and again, there are plenty of exceptions that I've seen all over the world and that I've seen in many different organizations, when we look at the amount of funding and the amount of resources that is devoted to top-down efforts compared to the one that goes directly to the grassroots peace builders, the last statistics I saw was in this report by the Conducive Space for Peace project. It was released last week, and they showed that it's terrible. So the contribution, the support to grassroots bottom-up effort in international aid in general was 3.5% in 2010. It was supposed to increase, with the Global Compact, it was supposed to increase to at least 20%. I mean, 20% is still not a lot, but it was supposed to increase to 20% by 2020. It has actually decreased to 2.1%. So there is still very little support to these grassroots initiatives. And I think that we're all in this call, we're all in trying to better support this grassroots effort and to amplify them and to amplify their voices and amplify the actual effects that they have. And that leads to Rachel's questions. So the first, for those of you who don't remember, I wrote it down when Rachel was speaking. So for those of you who don't remember, Rachel was saying, so many NGOs and UN personnel have begun to adopt the language of local empowerment, community building on the insider's knowledge, etc. And every NGO have their own stories of how they're doing things differently. And I completely agree, Rachel. What's really interesting when I present the Frontlines of Peace is that very often people tell me, oh yeah, that's what I've been doing in my work, and this is how I support. And whether, it's not only non-governmental organizations, it's also when I talk with peacekeeping missions, when I talk with diplomats, etc. Everybody, it's a buzzword. Local empowerment, putting local actors in the driver's seat. Now it's a buzzword in our field. But as you say, it remains a buzzword. It remains a rhetoric in most cases. We're talking the talk, but we're not walking the walk. And so your question was, how do we distinguish the ones that are actually walking the walk before, for students who are trying to enroll in international aid? So, I mean, the first thing is that I got this question so many times that by my own students, that now I have and by people who anyway, now I have a list on my website. So I put a list in the book, of the organizations. And I also have a list on my website. There is a dedicated page for the book, and I list the organizations that I feature in the Frontlines of Peace. And that do excellent work, and I have links to their website. So, that's a first step. But as you say, what's really important to keep in mind is that first, there are plenty other, and it goes back to what Laurie was saying, that when he was in South Africa, he was already doing that part of the world and of the work. And there are so many organizations that already work like that, that it would be pointless to try to list them all on a website or in a book, at least for the kind of book that I'm writing. So, and the other thing is that I haven't found one organization that does absolutely everything right. And again, that goes back to what you were saying. Yes, we do see people who work for the organizations that I list on my website and that I mentioned, and who actually sometimes don't do the right thing, which is normal. We're all human, and organizations make mistakes and people make mistakes. But what's important is that we can learn from them, and that there are organizations that actually encourage the kind of bottom-up, insider-led peace building that I mentioned, like the Life and Peace Institute, the Resolve Project, etc. And an organization that make it more difficult. And from what I hear from my former students and my friends who work for certain United States agencies, well, it's much more difficult to put these kind of ideas in place when you work for a big United Nations. Well, United States is not much easier, but for a big United Nations agency than when you work for the Resolve program or for the Life and Peace Institute. And to me, that leads to what's really important and the way I want to answer your question, because I want to actually rephrase and reframe your question. Your question was, how can we identify the organizations that are already doing things right so that we can join them and work with them? And I mean, that's how we could interpret it. And my way to answer would be, actually, let's forget about that. Let's join any peace building organizations, see what they're doing on the ground, because sometimes, time and place matters a lot. And so sometimes an organization that used to do everything right, the team will change and they will do everything wrong. Just like an organization that used to be the total Peace Inc. thing, they get a new team and they suddenly start working in ways that are absolutely fantastic. So let's forget about trying to identify from the beginning. Let's join peace building organizations. And if they're not already doing everything right, let's change them from the inside. And that's what I'm encouraging my students to do. And that's why I wrote the book, because many people who work for peace building organizations were telling me, I agree with all of these ideas. I want to make them a reality. I don't know how to do. It's really hard within my own organization. And I want to show that within every organizations we know, every peace building organizations, there are already people doing the kind of work that we know is effective, that we know works. And so if I can, we can use them as role models, and they can use the Frontlines of Peace as a way to help advocate for their ideas and to convince their colleagues and their bosses that it's possible, it's effective, so it's worth trying. And from what I know from the emails I've been receiving recently, a lot of people have just taken the book and run away with it, and they're doing this kind of advocacy within their organizations, which is, to me, this is fantastic. This is what I wanted. And on the question you got from the chief in the Ruzizi plane, so fantastic that you managed to talk to someone in the Ruzizi plane. So for those who don't remember, the question was, how can they protect local community resources and organizations in environments where the state is predatory, which is a huge issue in Congo and in many other conflict zones. For example, in Colombia, same thing. People have had to build peace. The people in San Jose de Apartado community, they've built peace against the state rather than building peace thanks to the state. And to me, that's why again, we go back to the idea that we really need both top down and bottom up, because we need to reform the state. We need to work with elites. That's why also international involvement is important, because international actors who have a lot more power and a lot more influence on national and international level elites than unfortunately local inhabitants, local residents, or even the chief in the Ruzizi plane will have on the government in Kinshasa. Although some kind of local residents have a lot more power than we think to change things in the capital city. And I see you nodding, so I know you agree with me, and I'm sure that the chief would be able to tell you as well of many of the contacts that he has in Kinshasa and that are helping him protect his community. And the last part of my answer is that we should stop focusing on the state as the port of the as like the central port of the answer to everything. We have this obsession about rebuilding states, and in places like Congo, actually rebuilding a state means what we've done is that we've rebuilt and we've strengthened what is a predatory predatory organization. And so that goes back to the Peace Inc. approach and how we have to change the Peace Inc. approach, et cetera, and all of the principles that we've discussed today. And I think that it's high time that I stop talking, right?
Thank you so much, Séverine, for trying to tackle some very in-depth, thoughtful questions and comments from Rachel and Laurie. So we're going to keep you going, though, as well as Laurie and Rachel, with a few other fantastic questions that have come in, and get as much out of you as possible in our remaining time. One question that I thought would be a good one to start with from the Q&A that have come in is building off of what you were just commenting on. This is a question about, is military intervention necessary in civil conflicts or armed conflicts generally, or can empowering ordinary people alone in such situations suffice? So kind of, again, getting at that, you know, how to deal with the bigger picture and the structures and the elite actors and governance actors, while also empowering communities. And I'll package that with, there are two other questions that also talk about the empowerment techniques and approaches in particular. One question is about IDWI, as your example that you wrote about, and if there's a specific activity that you'd want to illustrate for those who haven't read the book yet, and generally these techniques for empowerment. So if you can balance those two types of questions about empowerment examples, as well as, again, more about balancing the engagement with military when it's necessary, along with the empowerment activities.
Thank you so much, Mara, for highlighting these questions, and thanks to the people who submitted these questions. These are really key points. On military intervention, I haven't seen a case where violence, and to me, the use of force military intervention is the use of violence or the threat of violence. To me, violence does not resolve violence. Violence begets more violence. So but it doesn't mean that empowering people alone suffices. To me, it's much more complex, as we've been discussing with Laurie and with Rachel. We need to do a lot more. So relying exclusively on military intervention, like we've been doing for years in Congo and like we're doing in many other conflict zones, that doesn't lead to good outcomes. Empowering people wouldn't be enough either. We need to have bottom-up, top-down, insiders, outsiders. The military have a very specific role to play as well, to protect people, to stand between combatants at very specific period of time. We need to reframe their involvement. So I understand that I have to keep my answer short so that we can get through as many questions as possible. I talk extensively about that in the book, but the answer to your question is none of the above. Basically, military intervention is not necessary. Empowering people a lot does not suffice. We need to have a lot more, but we need to change the way we view and build peace. And on the specific activities in HW and the general techniques for empowerment, so I can give you a lot of specific ideas about HW. So I'll give you one because you asked me for specific examples, but it's something very basic. When you have a conflict in HW, let's say a conflict over land or a conflict because between two families because there is a couple and the husband cheated on the wife or the wife cheated on the husband, like, you know, some kind of conflicts, people go to local mediators. And the local mediators can be like a wise woman or a wise man, an elder, can be a priest. Local priests have a lot of influence, can be a trusted mediator who's done a lot of mediation before. I mean, it can be a lot of different people, teachers, a lot of different people. And so what's really interesting in HW is that the primary line for people to help resolve conflict is this kind of trusted local mediators, people who actually don't use violence and who are non-violent resolution of conflict, as opposed to what I've seen in very violent parts of Congo, which is that when there is a problem, people tend to reach out to their connections within armed groups, within the army, within the police, within the state, which, as Rachel was mentioning, is a predatory structure. And so that triggers more violence. But the thing, and that goes to the really central point about general techniques for empowerment, is that there is no template. And I made really sure in the book that I didn't provide a template for empowerment because everything is context specific. What I show in the book is that supporting local efforts, that works only if you take the very local circumstances in mind. And if you take them into account and you tailor everything to the local situation. So a technique for empowerment that will work in Ituri will not necessarily work in the Ruzizi Plain, which is very close by, or will not necessarily work in Kinshasa or in other parts of Congo, and even less in Israel or the Palestinian territory or Colombia. And I really, and that's why I give so many examples and so many stories in the Frontlines of Peace, to show that there are many different ways to empower local people, and so that people who are interested can read about these different ways, not because they want to take it as a template and apply it directly, but rather because that can give them ideas that with their understanding of local situations, they can then tailor and use in local situations.
Thank you. I also had wanted to make sure you were aware of the Peace Accords Matrix work at the Kroc Institute, which of course you are, as you are nodding, when you mentioned the examination of Peace Accords, since that project has, I think, 34 peace accords, peace agreements over a 20-year period have been studied, examined, and evaluated. And currently, for the first time, the team is doing real-time monitoring of the Colombia Peace Accord, and in hopes that that will keep things on track and possibly over time have the Colombia Agreement be a success story. But I had just wanted to flag that for our audience, that is an area of expertise at the Keough School within the Kroc Institute. We have time for a couple more questions. There's some really good ones. So I'm going to ask this one. My question is, the states which are occupied by the neighboring countries against UN resolution, i.e. Kashmir, how can the peace be reinstated in such states when they do not have the representative in the UN or UN Security Council or any such body of the UN? If you have any thoughts on that one, or maybe Laurie might jump in as well, but go ahead, Séverine.
No, actually, Laurie, do you want to jump in? I've been talking all the time. I'm more than happy to defer to you, and then I'll just add a few words afterwards, if you want, Laurie.
Thank you. If you don't mind, Maura, I want to jump back to the earlier question, as opposed to focus on this one. So I'm surrendering the question of occupation to Rachel and Séverine. The question of empowerment of local actors. You know, I think external actors that pose the question, how can we empower local actors? The short answer is go and ask them. I mean, you're making an assumption that they need a whole lot of empowerment. Well, that may not be the case. And you're making a critical error if you think you know what empowerment they need, as opposed to asking them. So if external actors are serious about local ownership, which they claim to have been for at least 20 years, without significant transformation in practice, I think we have to look at the reasons why the external actors find it so difficult to follow the advice that Séverine has given, to be truly respectful of local peacemaking. And there's no time for a long story here, but just a couple of reasons why there has been this lack of transformation. The one is just plain arrogance. The external actors come into our societies and think that we are broken and they can fix us because they come from societies that are not broken. So there's the arrogant assumption. Second, they are righteous or self-righteous. They're coming in with a savior mentality. They have the right values, the right experience, the right resources to help us fix our societies. Thirdly, they're unconscious of their power, as strange as that may seem. They don't appreciate adequately that we say yes as local actors because we don't have the confidence and power and resources to say no. So we say yes to the offers of assistance, even when we don't want it, or we don't want it in the way it's been given. Fourth problem is that from the side of the partners and donors, there are strong bureaucratic pressure to produce results, to fund concrete projects, not to fund processes. So to fund reconciliation, well, that's just like wishy-washy or mushy, whereas to build a bridge or a daycare center gives you a visible product that you can take a photograph of. And then finally, the timeframes that donors are working to, with an annual budget and then an annual report to your minister who reports to Parliament, et cetera, is not conducive to the kind of pace and patience that is required for effective work at grassroots level. Short advice to the externals is stop talking and start listening.
So I lost track of time. A terrible job in moderating, and I have so many other questions that I would like to ask you in addition to others, but I apologize. I've brought us even a minute or two over. Any last words for us to leave with and to inspire us all as peace builders?
I'm just going to emphasize what Laurie just said. I was listening to him and I was like, oh, that's exactly what I say some of the media interviews and conferences I've given last week, I was saying the exact same thing. I fully agree. And that's really, really important. And just one word on the question the person asked about how states occupied by neighboring countries who don't have UN representation. That's why the Somaliland example is so important, because they're an autonomous region. They're not recognized as a sovereign country. They have managed to build peace and to maintain their peace in the face of Somalia always trying to take over their countries for the past 20 years without UN representation, etc. So again, don't have the time to elaborate on that, but what's the last word that I want to leave you with is the fact that there are so many role models. There are so many role models for states occupied by neighboring countries. You have Somaliland. For people who work at the grassroots or who see their own communities run down by violence. You can, if you live in conflict zones, you can look at the people in each. We have that managed to actually to decrease violence in their communities. You can look at, there are so many examples in the book. If you live in the United States or in Europe, I have examples also from the United States, from Europe. We can all help make things better in our own communities. And if you want to get involved in local peace building, or if you are already involved in international peace building, there are role models within every organization, every country. There are really a lot of role models that we can learn from, and whose model we can follow, so that we help transform our field and we help actually build peace, whether we're talking about building peace abroad or building peace at home.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time, Séverine. This has been delightful. I'm sure we'll have you back on campus as soon as possible, since you're always welcome and have been a wonderful guest many times before. Thank you to Laurie and Rachel for your fantastic contributions to today's discussion, and to those of you who've been with us watching and contributing questions to the conversation. Have a nice afternoon, everyone.